Thank you, Chairman. This is obviously a place for difficult questions. Can anybody hear? So, the question, let me give you some support about this question, what is a region? We're still arguing about this in the European Union after 40 years of regional policy. We've never managed, there are many answers to the question. And you don't really have to worry about it. You can have a regional policy without knowing what a region is. The most important thing you'll have to discover is what do you have statistics for? Because if you're going to have evaluation and monitoring and things of this sort, you will need statistics to carry that out. So you will have statistics for administrative regions. And now you can argue that an administrative region is not a functional region and all sorts of things. But don't worry, there are ways around it. You don't need to know what is a region in order to have a regional policy. I'll try to answer Yuri's questions, but in a very indirect way. The first thing I wish to salute with you is that today is an important day because the new commissioner in charge of the EU relations with Ukraine is in Kiev today for his first visit. It's his first visit out of Brussels since he was nominated, and it's his first visit to Kiev. And he will sign this afternoon, I hope this afternoon, an agreement between the European Union and Ukraine, which says that the European Union will give budget support for the further work that you have in Ukraine to create regional policy. And this, I think, is a big step forward, something which has been in the kitchen, as it were, for a long time. And it's a big step that is being signed, I hope, today. So that's the good news. The bad news is that he comes with a rather tough message. And his message for Ukraine is that if the relationship between the European Union and the Ukraine is to progress, especially on regional policy, then it's necessary that Ukraine reforms its system of governance. Now, listening this morning to the discussions in this room, I was struck by the following simplification of life, if you like. If you want to change something, there are three big questions that you have to answer. The first is you have to work out where you are. The people this morning were talking about changing their finishing line, but the first thing is what sort of system do you have now? The second is what sort of system do you actually want to finish up? This is the second question is obviously more difficult to arrive at a consensus. The third question, which is even more difficult, and listening to Mrs. Popova was talking about Kosovo, this was driven into me again. The third question is how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? Now this is really, really difficult. It's taken Kosovo many years. She said that decentralization takes a long time. And it's very, we've been working on regional policy in the European Union for 40 years. And one of its biggest innovations was only brought in this year. So you can see it's taken us a long, long time to try to perfect our policy. These are not things that happen quickly. And so part of my reply to Yuri about how does Ukraine approach itself to, let's say, the European Union model is that it has to start off with something like modesty. We have to admit to ourselves that by starting to build a regional policy in Ukraine, or a cohesion policy, whatever you want to call it, is a long job. And for every 2 steps forward, there will be 1 step backwards. So your initial objectives have to be modest. This also came to me when the Minister was talking about evaluation. We tried for from 1989 to 2014 to institute a system of evaluation which could be carried through to take resources away from regions which we didn't think were performing well and to give extra resources to regions which we thought were performing well. It sounds easy to do, but it's extremely difficult to do it fairly and to do it objectively and to avoid the allegations. In actual fact, what's going on when you punish one region to help another is that you're just punishing an enemy and helping a friend. So these things take a lot of time, and if you try to come into business, as it were, with the most up-to-date regional policy in existence, you'll probably never ever manage to get started. You have to start with something that you can realise within a reasonable time frame. And Commissioner Hahn will certainly be pressing Ukraine to be realistic in its reform ambitions, because he will want assurances that you can carry out certain reforms in a certain time scale, and that will be, as it were, conditional on the kind of help that he would want the European Union to give. And let me say one more thing about Commissioner Hahn. He would say, if he were here, I'm sure, that the major funding for the modernisation of Ukraine's economy is going to have to come from the private sector. And the objective of reform has got to be to make the Ukrainian economy a safe place for investors. And that would be something I guess that he will insist on. It's already evident that this is a key part of his thinking. So let me just tell you a little bit about EU regional policy, which we would call, I think, EU, from now on, EU cohesion policy. Until now it's had two names, and now it's got two components, and the proper name for it would be EU cohesion policy. It has two objectives. The first is the regional policy objective of helping backward regions to catch up with, let's say, the EU average. So you're trying to stimulate the economic development of the worst off parts of the European Union so that they can catch up with the average. And until the crisis bit in 2006, there was a broad movement of convergence in the European Union. You could see that the policy was actually working. The second thing that the policy does is to establish a macroeconomic growth instrument for the European Union, because it helps not only the badly off regions, it helps all regions. It gives more help to the badly off regions than it does to the others, but there's support from the European Union for all regional economies in the European Union, so that they can improve their growth performance. And what this kind of policy brings to the national government in terms of economic policy making is that regional policy or cohesion policy is spatially aware. It knows where it's doing things. For the other big policies operated by the government, the macroeconomic policies, they are spatially blind. They make things happen, but they don't know exactly where things will happen in particular ways. But regional policy brings this spatial awareness to policy making, which is extremely important. And research has shown for us that our policy has a number of good results. The first research, which is reassuring, is that fiscal redistribution helps economic growth. So if you have a policy which is moving money around and helping regions, then you are actually helping growth. And the same research shows that if you don't try to equalize regions, then it's bad for growth. So the idea that you can just let markets concentrate the Ukrainian economy everywhere where the market wanted to do so is not the recipe for the fastest growth. The recipe for sustainable growth and steady growth is for governments to try to equalize economic opportunities throughout Ukraine, or throughout, in our case, the European Union. So, cohesion policy or regional policy for us has these two components. Backward regions, support for them. All regions, support for them at a lower level to try to help them to grow more quickly. One other point, I'm making 5 points, and this is my third, so you can see we're nearly over. So my third point is that underlying these policies, this cohesion policy in the European Union, is a system of values. And we don't often talk about it, because in the European Union they're all taken for granted. But if you're wanting to try to look at European Union regional policy and to work out what can this, how could this relate to Ukraine, you have to be aware that it carries with it a number of values which are important for, let's call it the social market model, which is practiced in the European Union. So it is based on the idea of freedom of opportunity. So freedom of opportunity to create businesses or to get education or whatever. Freedom of opportunity. And it's not a freedom of opportunity for an individual at a particular moment in their lives. It's freedom of opportunity for individuals every day of their lives. So it's not a question of when somebody says, I can't get a job, well, you should have stayed at school for longer. You made a mistake when you were young, so you now pay the price all of the time. No, it's a policy which allows people to correct for anything they decided in the past and to actually always seek freedom of opportunities. And it's based on a freedom of markets. But the market freedom in the European Union is not a religion, or it's not a firmly rooted ideology, because it's understood that markets don't always give society what society wants or needs. I've already said that if you leave markets to handle regional policy, what will happen is that you have growth centres which grow and grow and grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger, and that this is bad for economic development. So sometimes market behaviour has to be corrected, and sometimes markets, when they break down, have to be helped to start again. And market breakdown is extremely common. If you go to the United States and talk to the high priests of market behaviour, they don't think markets ever break down. But markets are always breaking down. I could take you to parts of the European Union where you can't borrow money from banks, even in good times. Why? Because the banks won't want to run the risks which are associated with the investment that you make in particular areas. In other words, the market breaks down. The market for loanable funds breaks down quite frequently. And then, of course, there's the other value is the social system, which is characterized by solidarity between people and between communities. And the idea of participation in society, which is expressed in terms of EU cohesion policy through the principle of partnership and through the subsidiarity principle. So try to, when you're talking about European Union policy, always remember that behind it there are a set of values, and you have to decide, or Ukraine has to decide, whether these are values which Ukraine wants to actually build into its society, or whether it has something else it wants to do. So what does EU cohesion policy require in order to work? Well, it requires a legal system which entrenches the rule of law and non-discrimination. And this requires two things. The first thing is obviously people behave according to the law. And the second thing is that the governments adopt the laws which are necessary. I was talking to some South African people on Monday, and one of the people was saying that he'd been recruiting, he was in charge of a security agency, and he'd been recruiting a head of the security agency, and he had 4 candidates for the final test, and he'd asked them only one question. And the question he asked to each of these 4 candidates to be the head of a security system was, is theft a sin or a crime? And all of the candidates said it was a crime. And if you think about it, that is only a part of the answer. Because quite clearly, if it's only a crime, well, if you don't get caught stealing, then that's okay. You can steal as long as you don't get caught. Or, if you only get lightly punished when you steal, it's worth stealing, because you might not get caught, and even if you are caught, you don't get lightly punished. It's only if you have some moral underpinning which says that stealing is wrong, as it were, that you... I don't know whether he employed any one of the 4 candidates, but for EU cohesion policy, the rule of law is important. Government must be transparent. The personnel who carry out government must be free of corruption, and the administrations must be capable. Now, I'm not trying to say to you that there's no corruption in the European Union. There is. I'm not trying to say to you that administrations in the European Union are all capable, because they're not. And I'm not trying to say to you that the rule of law always triumphs in the European Union, because it doesn't. So I'm not sort of trying to say to you that the European Union is a paragon of all virtue. But what I am saying is these are the things that one tries to maximize, because you have to build the policy on trust between the levels of government, because it involves all of the levels of government, and between investors and customers and so on. So you're trying always to run the policy in a way which maintains trust. Now, my last point is to try to tell you how European Union cohesion policy has worked for the Union. It offers to the European Union a policy cycle which integrates the interests of central, regional, local, city, rural government, however you like to define it. It, to a certain extent, removes a great deal of the ideology from development, because it makes it a rather technical affair. So one of the important things about the European Union cohesion policy is that the budget is agreed for 7 years ahead, which is longer than the electoral cycle for the European Union. Which means that, and the budget is set and allocated according to objective criteria. So it's not an allocation, there may be some adjustment at the end for political reasons, but I could tell you that something like 90% of the budget is given out according to technical criteria. That's 90% of 350 billion euros over 7 years is allocated between regions on objective criteria, which withstand all sorts of political argument. European cohesion policy sets decision-making at the appropriate level. So some decisions have to be taken by national government, obviously. Some are taken by, let's call it regional government, or would be taken by oblasts. Some are taken by cities. Some are taken by villages. They're taken at different levels, wherever, in actual fact, the people are best qualified to make the decisions. It's based on medium-term strategy making and turning strategies into action. This is very important. It's very tempting to spend ages talking about strategy, in which case nothing, of course, ever gets done. And it's monitored, and it's evaluated. And it's been evaluated now for about 10 years or more, in a fairly strict way, and as I said earlier, we're now on the point of moving into a phase where we could use this system of evaluation to actually take resources away from regions which are not using it properly and give them to regions which are using them. But the whole thing is underpinned by the capacity of administrators, the capacity of administrations. And the policy uses a fair amount of its budget, 5%, up to 5%, for the training and education of the people who actually make the policy work and have to make the decisions on which projects and actions should be supported. If we do that, we're able to be confident that the policy rests on an administration which is able, which can understand all of the different conditions which face it, and which is honest.